I'll just continue on in the text, and then we'll pause for questions or discussion or something, but cover a little bit of this. So we just finished the section where Lama Tsongkhapa was emphasizing this point that you have to combine, that for effective practice of Mahayana path, you have to combine method, meaning these practices that express compassion, with wisdom, right? Ultimately here the wisdom understanding emptiness. And then Lama Tsongkhapa actually quotes the Sutra Samyukaya, the compendium of all sutras, where it says, basically what it says here, I'll read the quote: Bodhisattvas who are separated from skillful means should not make strong effort in the profound Dharma. So what he's saying there is that if somebody's practicing the Mahayana path, then let's see this right, one shouldn't put too great an emphasis on wisdom without compassion. There needs to be a balance. And there's a traditional metaphor for that, of an eagle flying, right, that needs two wings, and the two wings should be equal, and if they're not equal, then the eagle won't fly straight. So the point there is that one's compassion, one's practice of method, and wisdom should be balanced. And I'll just go on. So then he quotes another sutra that says, childhood lineage is like this. For instance, a fire burns due to a cause. If the cause is absent, it subsides. Likewise, a mind blazes due to an observed object. If the observed object is absent, it subsides. And then he goes on to explain that. Actually, he goes on to explain that quote. I wanted to go into this just a little bit because I think it's an important point. He's getting at a point that he kind of was starting to address in the earlier section, and the next paragraph he explains that. So what he's really saying here is this, is that sometimes people think that meditation is just sort of blanking out your mind, right? Like just not thinking of anything. And what he's saying is that's not correct. That's not correct meditation. And so he says here, some people think just completely extinguish all observed objects, right? So there, what he's saying is some people sort of have this idea, and actually people had it at that time in Tibet, and people have it sometimes now, this wrong idea, that when you meditate, the idea is you just sort of like space out, or you just sort of try to be non-conceptual in some sense, but without anything that the mind is engaging with. And what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying about meditation is that's not a correct version of meditation. And then he says there are some quotes that say, in various sutras, various Buddhist texts that say, that emphasize non-conceptuality, and there are different meanings to that in different contexts. But what he's emphasizing here is what one is trying to do. In other words, what he's saying, part of meditation is recognizing that we sometimes get caught up in destructive conceptuality, right, and destructive emotions. So, and he's saying, those quotes are saying we do need to disengage from that. Does that make sense? And let's give an example of what he's talking about here, just on a very simplistic level. If you check your own mind, right, we're often caught up in, what's the word, like conceptual elaborations, sometimes they use that term, related to anger, related to desire, related to pride, related to promoting our own self-image or something like that. He's saying, of course, those things we do need to disengage from, right? And so when it says like disengage from conceptuality, what he's saying is, what he's pointing out here is there are all these kinds of what he's calling non-virtuous, destructive, unhealthy patterns of conceptuality that we do need to disengage from if we're going to meditate. So if you were just to sit there and like think, I'm really angry at this person, they did this wrong, they did that wrong, and they're so annoying in this way and that way. Of course, that's not meditation. That's just anger, right? And the same thing with desire, right? Like oftentimes when we think we're going to meditate, we're engaging in sort of like, I want this and I want that, and how can I promote getting that or promote myself in some way? And he's saying, of course, those things we do have to disengage from. And I guess, Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't say this, but I think when we're starting out in our practice, sometimes we have, especially in all cultures, and I think especially in the West, we can have so much, because we're educated to sort of, we actually have a culture, I will say that, like, if you compare our culture to most other traditional cultures, certainly Tibetan culture, um, it's just like a little bit more, what's the word, calm. Like, like there's not as much. I mean, we're educated with this sort of, especially in this area, right? With like continuous sort of, you see kids and they're just like, they never have a break, actually, right? From whether it's school, video games, like social media, and whatever, YouTube or something. And so in that sense, we are trying to decrease our conceptuality, right? But that doesn't mean that all concepts are bad. And so then Lama Tsongkhapa goes on to explain, he says, so when you're meditating though, what you actually want to do is you want to calm down all that kind of conceptuality, but then you want to engage the mind in something positive, right? And so he gives, so he doesn't hear, but I mean in other parts of the text, he gives, so compassion, right? Whereas compassion is conceptual, right? Whereas you're recognizing, wow, others are suffering, and I'm suffering, and I have empathy for their suffering, and I want to alleviate their suffering. That's a version of conceptuality, right? Love is conceptual, right? And conceptual in Buddhism doesn't mean intellectual. Does that make sense? Conceptual just means that you have, what's the word? That there's a mental image involved, or that there's mental activity involved, mental images, thoughts, and so on, right? So, in other words, if you're feeling love from your heart, from a Buddhist perspective, that's conceptual, in the sense that it's not some non-conceptual state. Does that make sense? You have an idea. Oh, this person, I love them. I want to make them happy. I want to help them. There are concepts involved in that. And Lama Tsongkhapa is pointing out that is meditation. That's a very wonderful version of meditation, and that's meditation that's on the method aspect of the path, right? Love, compassion, service, and then we're going to go into the 6 perfections, right? So generosity, for example, is the first of the 6 perfections. Generosity, of course, involves some concept. You have to think, I want to give this to somebody, right? So that's conceptual. So he's saying, don't make the mistake of thinking that meditation is just some non-conceptual thing. Does that make sense? And that's very practical advice for our practice, because, again, even now you'll see people who think that's what meditation is, and will sort of promote that idea, but that's not correct. So that's one point. And so Lama Tsongkhapa here, he makes that point very clearly. He says, the idea is not to allow observed objects of the mental afflictions to arise. So that means, actually, I'll just make a point, with the mental afflictions, right? So like, those are the examples I just gave, like, say, craving or hatred, right? That we actually, if you look at how it works, right? If you're feeling hatred for somebody, right, there's a mental image of that person in your mind, right? And then there are all these conceptual thoughts about them. They're bad, they're no good, they did this wrong, they did that wrong, I want to do this or that to harm them in some way. So what he's saying is, in meditation, you want to remove the image of them and the image of all those thoughts. That you do want to decrease and eventually cut off. But then you want to replace it with something. And in the case of, in Buddhist practice, usually the antidote to hatred is love, right? So you would want to cultivate loving kindness then or something. So the point being here, it's not just some blanking out of your mind. Does that make sense? Okay. And so here he's just going into a little more detail. I'll just say briefly about it. So he says, he points out here, he says, he's making the same point in a little more detail. He says, the bonds of the mental afflictions, right? So those are our mental afflictions in our own mind. Apprehending signs. So that means signs means these conceptual thoughts, like, holding on to this idea of this other person and that they're truly existent and that I'm angry at them because they're really the way I think they are. He's saying those need to be loosened. So we need to kind of let go of those, loosen in the sense we need to let go of those kinds of conceptual elaborations. But then he's saying, on the other hand, there are other kinds of mental elaborations that we want to actually, he says, tighten up or kind of hold on to in a sense. And those would be ones like love and compassion, that we don't want to let those go and just lose them. We actually want to increase them at this point. Then he says this phrase, the 2 misdeeds need to be destroyed. There, the 2 misdeeds are, what he's getting at there are 2 types in this particular context. There are 2 types. One are natural misdeeds. So those are things that are naturally negative. Does that make sense? Like, for example, stealing from somebody would be a naturally negative thing to do that everybody recognizes hurts somebody. And then there's a second category of misdeeds, which are not naturally bad, but if you vowed or promised not to do something, then keeping that promise. Does that make sense? So it's a way of differentiating. Some things are by their very nature bad, like killing somebody. Right? There are other things which are not intrinsically bad, but if you promise not to do it. So for example, if somebody's in a, it's a very simple example. If somebody's in a monogamous relationship and they promise not to be with other people and they go be with other people, the act of just being with somebody is not intrinsically negative, but you're breaking a promise, or a vow or a commitment, so that becomes negative in that sense. And they are also in that, the ones that are committed to, that would also include so if somebody's a practitioner, they took the lay precepts of Buddhism, or a monk or a nun, and they break those commitments, those are promises they're breaking. So they're not intrinsically bad, but they're bad because you promised not to do them. So he's saying those things do need to be abandoned, whereas, and then he points out also, not just, so here he's getting into actions, not just mental elaboration. He's saying, so those kinds of actions need to be abandoned, whereas virtuous actions don't need to be abandoned, they need to be done, actually. Right? So generosity is an example of that. And so part of what he's getting at here, I'll just make a point, because this is related again to meditation, is in order to do this, actually, there's a whole point in Buddhism. They has a phrase in Buddhism which he doesn't use here, but it's used other places. Knowing what to adopt and what to abandon. And that's really core to what Buddhist meditation is about. So Buddhist meditation isn't about abandoning everything, and it isn't about just being non-conceptual, right? But it's knowing in your own, and this is not, it's not for somebody else, it's in your own mind in this case. Does that make sense? Knowing what is a mental affliction. Like if you don't know that, then you don't know what to abandon. Does that make sense? So you have to know in yourself, because sometimes we think, well, my hatred's good. I like it, or something like that. Well, then you don't know what to abandon, right? So the idea here is you have to be able to identify in your own experience, and sometimes it's subtle, right? Like if you ask somebody in their own experience, what's the difference between pride and healthy self-esteem, for example, right? Well, you have to check for yourself, right? You have to be able to tell the difference in your own experience from those things. Does that make sense? I'm just giving an example here, because if you can't tell the difference, then you don't know which one to adopt, which one is healthy, and which one you need to abandon. Does that make sense? So we have to be able to differentiate in our own experience what's a mental affliction that's causing us suffering and causing others suffering and compounding our suffering, and what's a healthy state of mind that we want to not abandon, or we want to either let remain or enhance. Does that make sense? So you have to know which is which.
Right, sort of making like a subjective value assessment of what that.
Actually, I mean, to some extent, although actually it's interesting, in Buddhist, there's not details of this, actually, some of them are in this text and some aren't, but some are in other teachings, but part of it is subjective and part of it is let's describe it this way. In Buddhist psychology, so there's a whole field of Buddhist psychology where they actually, and it's interesting because what they do is they'll describe, they'll give an example, they're like different states of mind that they define. Some are neutral, some are positive, some are negative, and they'll describe using words, like this is what that state is like.
So there's like an objective methodology actually to apply to it?
Yeah, exactly. And then they'll say, and then the training of that, what you actually do is you read, so you'll study, okay, this is what craving is like, versus this is what loving kindness is like. And then I'll use that as an example, like craving versus loving kindness, right? Because then a lot of times when if we say love, well, sometimes that includes craving, sometimes that's loving kindness. From a Buddhist perspective, it could be either one. So you study, for example, what is the description of those two states of mind? But then you have to, then comes the subjective part. You have to then check in your own experience. Well, first of all, can I tell the difference between, if there's a person who I'm, connected to, well, am I craving for them right now, or am I being kind, having loving kindness for them? So you check for yourself, and then you have to check for yourself, do I agree that this is healthy? Mm-hmm. Do I agree that the cause of happiness is genuine loving kindness? Do I agree, can I see in my own experience that craving actually leads me to some kind of dissatisfied inner state that causes me more suffering, and maybe causes the partner or friend more suffering? So you then have to check it for yourself. Mm-hmm. But there are guidelines in Buddhism I would call them guidelines for introspection, where you can so they describe many, many, many different inner states that then you can you read about them, and then you go meditate and you actually analyze, well, what's my own experience? First of all, can I identify those states? And then can I see that they cause happiness or cause suffering? Because once you see that, then you actually are at the point where Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, where if you see, well, that's really causing me suffering, you're actually happy to abandon it. right? Whereas
Right,
if you
right.
see, oh, this causes me happiness, then you really want to adopt it more,
Mhm.
cultivate it.
When you mentioned this, it was kind of interesting. The way I was kind of thinking about it is that what I see in work a lot is that we've got too much information going on. And when you have too much information, is that the first thing you have to do is you have to start applying value judgments as to what's important, what's not important. Because once it gets to be too much, you just can't deal with it all. You have to start paring it down. And once you have what's important, then you have to start classifying it and organizing it. And so then when you were saying that, I was kind of thinking it's interesting if you consider like thoughts and conceptions like information. So the first thing that you have to do is that, you know, in this area, if we've got a lot of conceptions going on, is that you have to be like, okay, well, we have to start paring this down, okay? But in order for us to start paring this down, we have to start examining, you know, what exactly do we have here? And then once you're like, okay, I can classify this as to what it is, and then you kind of think, okay, well, you have to apply some sort of value judgment to this. Is this going to be useful? Is it going to have a positive net effect or a negative net effect? But if you don't do that, then you really don't even have the idea of what you need to get rid of or what you need to keep.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I'll share. First, yes, and also that, like, that's why if you think about what you just said, like, that's why if I think about what you said rather, like, I mean, that's why oftentimes, you know, whether it's having, you know, a quiet half hour or a quiet day, or going on a retreat for a weekend or something. I mean, that's in a sense why people do that, right? Is to sort of have these chances to pare it down, so then
Right.
you can do that. Because yeah, if you're surrounded by
Right.
data, it's too hard to do.
Right, and if you think about it, is that the amount of information that we have nowadays is just far, 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 far in excess than any time before in history. And so the way I kind of think about it is if you have the information, you're exposed to that, you know, sort of like constant media, constant stimulation, that's going to generate some more conceptions and thoughts in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So having more information and more stimulus is going to create more mental chatter at the same time. So if you can reduce the mental stimulus, then sometimes you can reduce, you know, the conceptions, and that'll give you enough breathing space to actually get in there and start looking at what you've got.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's right.
It was just interesting because what I found in my life is that, like, I never turn on my TV or do any of that kind of stuff, and that in many cases, the best work I can do at any given day is actually being like an editor and getting rid of stuff and keeping stuff.
That's why we have to do that externally and also internally as part
Right.
of what you're saying. Okay, I'll read this next paragraph because it's related. Now he's saying the same thing, but now on a subtler level. So now he's saying he's quoting Master Kamalashila, who is this great Indian master, meditation master, who wrote. I mentioned before, he wrote in another class. He wrote like a number of texts, including 3 like stages of meditation. 1 stages of meditation, 2 stages of meditation, 3. They're texts that the Dalai Lama often teaches on, and they were written in the early period of Buddhism coming to Tibet. But so he says here, Master Kamalashila refuted mental inattention, but does not refute meditation in which the mind is placed within the view that has settled the meaning of the matter. So here he's getting at a subtle point, but it's the same idea, but I'll mention it here. So here he's talking about, he's specifically applying, like earlier, the previous few paragraphs, he was talking about meditation on method mostly, right? Love and compassion and so on. Here he's talking about wisdom, actually. And what he's saying is, he's using Kamalashila as the source for this, but he's making a point, which is this. He's saying, Master Kamalashila pointed out that meditation on wisdom is not just blanking out your mind, right? It's not just placing, how does he say it? Mental inattention, right? So he's saying, refuted that mental inattention does not refute. So what he's saying here is meditation on wisdom is not just some kind of vague, non-conceptual state. Does that make sense? That's not wisdom. That's, I'm using my own phrase now, that's just spacing out. Does that make sense? Like, that's not...
Vegetation.
What's that?
Vegetation.
Yeah, it's not actually meditation, it's maybe more like vegetation. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And here what he's getting at is this, is that he's saying, here what he's actually saying is that if you, he's quoting Kamalashila, and he's saying, wisdom actually is where a person, through analysis, in this case, comes to a decisive, is that the word you use? A settled meaning, right? A clear understanding of the nature of reality in their contemplation. And then when they settle their mind on that object, that's meditation on wisdom, right? So that's not spacing out. That's actually a very what's the word? There's an object of the mind. That object of mind is emptiness, so it's not some, it's not compassion or loving kindness. In that case, it's actually emptiness. But so he's saying he's differentiating two different things. Actually, and I'll quote it here. He says, "What it's not is some kind of mere meditative stabilization, focusing without conceiving anything. That's not wisdom. But what wisdom is having an understanding of emptiness, and then focusing the mind on that. And so that's a subtler distinction, right? But what he's getting at is there's still a kind of mental engagement going on. And on this point, I'll just make a comment, which is that so here he's getting so there are different kinds of meditation, right? So one kind of meditation is like I was saying earlier, like if you're meditating on love, compassion, generosity, patience, ethics, and so on, those are obviously conceptual, right? Like you're thinking about what's the ethical thing to do and so on. But here, and I want to just sort of, is it okay if I go off on a small tangent, like, because there are versions of meditation, of course, in Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, in which the kind of conceptuality that's there becomes extremely subtle. Okay? And so, actually just now when I was in California, Ken Rinpoche was teaching on Mahamudra meditation. Right? So in Mahamudra meditation, actually, it starts off as a preliminary, one meditates on the conventional nature of the mind. Right? So, which is this clear knowing phenomena, or clear awareness. Right? Now in that sense, if one looks at, sometimes a person who's been extremely, conceptual in their life, that could seem like, oh, it's just non-conceptuality. But actually it's not. Does that make sense? There's a clarity there. And there's a quality of awareness there. That's not just sort of spacing out. It's actually, there's an object of mind, which is the mind itself. And then, one then meditates on the emptiness of that mind. The lack of intrinsic existence, or lack of inherent existence of that mind. Right? That's something quite precise. That's not just dropping all conceptual thoughts and just sort of being in some non-conceptual state. It can seem like that. I guess I'm just pointing out is that I think for people who, like us, maybe who are often busy and have a lot to think about, that can seem like you're just trying to drop all conceptuality. But on a subtle level, you're engaging with something. Does that make sense? And you're supposed to be. In that case, clarity, for example, or awareness, or emptiness. And that's still correct meditation. Whereas when if one just tries to kind of rest in some, as he puts it, state without conceiving of anything, that's not correct meditation. So I think in terms of the language, I think it's pretty clear what he's saying. I think experientially one has to kind of get a sense of that. Does that make sense? Because you have to, if you start to meditate on those kinds of practices, which include things like emptiness meditation, calm abiding meditation, Mahamudra, Dzogchen, all those kinds of meditations, that then it becomes important experientially to be able to differentiate in your own experience. Like that this is not, I'm not just dropping all concepts and trying to sort of cultivate some state of non-engagement, but that I'm trying to actually be aware in a certain way of the nature of mind. And it could be, yes, I'll leave it at that. Does that make sense? Those are two different things. And if we mix them up, then what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is, if we get confused and think, oh, I'm just going to, again, not conceive of anything at all, then we've missed the point. Because there's a difference between not conceiving of anything at all and engaging and meditating on emptiness, or being aware of the nature of mind, the conventional nature of mind, the ultimate nature of mind, and so on. Those are two different things. So that's what he's saying there. And again, this is I'm just emphasizing because it's quite, in terms of actual practice, he's saying these things in a very clear way so we can understand them intellectually, so that then when we actually are meditating and we're sort of in this state, then we have to check ourselves and see, okay, well, which one am I doing? And intellectually, you can get this idea, but experientially, you have to kind of then check on yourself and sort of introspect and say, okay, in this session, which one was I doing?
The way I kind of see it, and that I could be wrong on this one, is that if you don't think about anything, then you're kind of reducing pain because at least you're not doing any harm to yourself. But if you're not actively engaging and trying to develop further, then you're not going to go any further. It's like you kind of reached like homeostasis.
Yeah, that's reasonable. Yeah, I think that's not. I'm just trying to positive. Yeah, that's.
Yeah. I was just thinking is that,
inadequate.
I mean, if you don't do anything, you're going to need some sort of like stress on the system in order for it to adapt and to learn more and become sort of expanded in that case. So if you don't put that good stress on the system, then you're just not going to go any further. You could be 10 years without thinking about nothing. You're going to be still in the same state.
Yeah, yeah. Or you may actually, and some Buddhists, not Lama Tsongkhapa is not saying this here, but some Buddhist teachers have pointed out that actually, if you do that version of meditation, the just not conceiving of anything, there are some Buddhist teachers who say, if you're doing that rather than this engaging in the nature of mind or engaging in some particular conceptual, more overtly conceptual thing like compassion, that actually you may stay the same or you may get worse. They point out that for some, I guess they point out in Tibet there were sometimes people who did that, they did that kind of mistake, and they found that if they engage in that a lot, that their sort of their mental clarity, their intelligence actually decreased over time. So you may stay the same, or you may actually get worse.
Yeah, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah. So they found that actually that was a danger of that version of meditation. Actually, is that you may just stay stuck, or you may actually lose some of your capacity for insight, where it becomes harder then to have those insights. And then Lama Tsongkhapa points out, he says, he's making a point about so within the Mahayana there's the general Mahayana, which they call the perfection vehicle, and then the vehicle or the teachings of mantra or of tantra. And he says this point that he's pointing out, he's saying this point I was just making is the same for mantra or the perfection vehicles. And then he says there are similarities and differences between those two systems with regards to analyzing the means of wisdom of individuals. So yeah, he says, I'll get into this more later, basically, is what he's saying. But he's saying both the tantric vehicle or the mantra vehicle and the general Mahayana perfection vehicle are the same in that the goal is not just some kind of not engaging, lack of mental engagement. In both cases, and actually in other texts, Lama Tsongkhapa and the commentary to this verse or paragraph, they point out that emptiness is the same, whether you're practicing the perfection vehicle or the vehicle of mantrayana or tantrayana. The understanding of emptiness needs to be the same. It's not different. So that's one point there. And then he's saying, but the methods that you engage with, particularly one main difference between those two is the level of subtlety. So I'll just say that because it's related to this. That in terms of this idea of mental engagement, that the wisdom understanding emptiness in the tantric vehicle and the regular Mahayana practices is actually the same. The object is the same, emptiness. The difference is the level of subtlety of the mind that engages emptiness. So in the perfection vehicle, it's a relatively grosser mind. Whereas in the tantric vehicle, the idea is you evoke an extremely subtle state of mind to meditate on emptiness. And that's in terms of emptiness, that's the difference. The difference is the level of subtlety of the mind understanding emptiness. It's not the emptiness itself. So that's just the starting point.
I've got a question. So the way I'm kind of looking at this is that, it could be right for the right time and the right place, to go to empty. And so what I'm thinking about is, just for an example, is like, let's say somebody's like in a really anxious situation. And that, let's say somebody's in their little youth soccer league, and that they get the ball and they're not really sure what to do next. And so you kind of have like a thought stream going on, like, I'm not good enough, I can't do it, yada, yada, yada. At that point, in order to kind of like come back to normal, do you just focus on the moment, don't think about anything, think about the sensations, just try and empty it out as much as possible? Or do you just try and start seeding good thoughts in there, and then hope that they kind of overwhelm the bad thoughts? So, for example, to put it another way, is that you've got a lot of here are your good thoughts and your bad thoughts, right? Your bad thoughts are up here, Do you try just to reduce as much as possible in the moment to kind of get to the next step, or do you just try and increase the good thoughts to the point where they drown out the bad thoughts? And so I was thinking that if you're just thinking about nothing, that could potentially be useful if you're just out of control and you're just like, if you can just like sort of like snuffing out a candle real quick.
Okay, I'll say a couple points. Like one is a few points. One is I guess I would differentiate different things there. So one is the emptiness. First of all, the emptiness being referred to here is a very specific kind of understanding of a kind of wisdom, a mental wisdom, which if you have that will stop. I mean, if the person were able to engage with that would stop all their negative thoughts. So that would that's one point. But I guess more generally, from a Buddhist training perspective, I guess you would say, if the person's capable of cultivating positive thoughts, right, at a moment where, like, let's say any of us, right, if you're having a lot of worries or something, whereas if you can cultivate a positive replacement for that, that's best option. But sometimes that's not possible, right? Like, whereas like if I'll give an example. Using your example, okay, we'll use that one. Like, so if the person's very anxious, right? Whereas if they can cultivate a sense of, joy and love for their teammates and, sort of something like that, great, but oftentimes we're not capable of going from extremely negative to extremely positive. So then there's like this intermediate step. But there's still a mental engagement at that point, right? So for example, if the person just focuses on their breath, right?
Right. You're still pulling a switcheroo in that case.
Yeah, you're focusing on the breath, not on, and the breath will decrease. The idea is if you really focus on the breath, you decrease those other mental elaborations or conceptualizations or something. And so that's part of the use of focusing on the breath, for example, is that it gets you to a neutral state, not to a positive state. But that's still quite useful if you're in a negative state. And so sometimes they also, I'll share one more point about that actually. I always think this is funny. Like in the West, so much of the meditation practice is breathing meditation, right? Like that's mindfulness, the mindfulness tradition emphasizes meditation on breath and sensations. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that's valued actually, but sort of like, I sometimes use a metaphor for that. I say sometimes, in the Tibetan tradition, if you look at meditation on the breath, it's a warm-up to actual meditation. Or it's like it's trying to get people to a neutral state so that then you can cultivate something with your mind. And so the metaphor I sometimes use, I say like, meditation on the breath, in the context of Tibetan Buddhism, is a little bit like stretching out before you do a sport. So you would stretch out before you might do any sport, right? It's a good idea, like whether you're going to do running or play basketball or play baseball or play soccer or something.
Right. The way I kind of see it is like it
It's
doesn't have
neutral.
emotional content. Right,
Yeah.
versus other thoughts typically do. So if you can replace it with something that doesn't have emotional content, and that'll kind of like bring you back down to a base level.
So that's the idea. The way they often talk about it is, so you're getting to a neutral, and then once you're in that neutral state, then you want to use that to cultivate something positive. Yeah.
So just last thing on this one.
Yeah.
So the whole thinking about nothing and trying to like just, I think there was like an Alan Watts quote where it's like trying to use an iron to like iron out like a pond.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
There was an Alan Watts quote about trying to reduce all thoughts. It's like taking an iron and trying to iron out the waves in a pond.
Oh.
It's funny. Good
Uh,
man.
But the way I always thought is that it was useful for getting to that neutral state, but if you stay there, you're not really going to develop any further.
Yeah, that's a fair one. Okay. And then now, so actually there Lama Tsongkhapa ended that section, and now he moves into how do you train in the Mahayana path. And then he makes the point about, so now he's getting into he's leading towards the 6 perfections, and he first makes the point about the Bodhisattva vow, which he covered a little bit before, but here he makes an interesting point about it. He says, so one can take the Bodhi, right, once you've cultivated a deep appreciation for bodhicitta, or cultivated some degree of bodhicitta, then you can take this Bodhisattva vow. And here Lama Tsongkhapa makes a point. He says, in the case of the Vinaya, first of all, which are monk and nuns' vows, you're not, how does he put it? It's inappropriate to listen to teachings on those until you've taken them. So he says, in the case of like a monk or a nun, they know a general outline, but they don't actually study the vows until after they've taken their vows. And then he says the same thing applies in Tantra, Highest Yoga Tantra, for example. yoga tantra and high yoga tantra. There are these tantric vows. If you're going to take like those initiations, you have to take certain. You don't have to take the initiation, but if you, and the two lower classes of tantra, there aren't tantric vows, but in the two, in yoga tantra and highest yoga tantra, the sort of more advanced, or more, advanced, I guess, levels of tantra, in order to take the initiation of those kinds of practices or enter into them, you first take certain commitments or vows or things like that. And those, again, you can get a general outline, but you don't study those vows until after you've entered into that kind of practice and taken them. And he says, but the bodhisattva practice is different. He says, in the bodhisattva practices, you can study them. You do study them before you take them. You should study them before you take them. And he says, so he's saying here, if you're thinking that you want to take the bodhisattva vow, he says, then study those topics and learn what they are before you take them, and make sure you understand them and understand the divisions of them and so on. And so in the bodhisattva vows, there are 18 like root bodhisattva vows and 46 secondary bodhisattva vows. And they all can be categorized in terms of the 6 perfections. So some of them are related to generosity, some are related to ethics, some are related to patience, some to joyous effort, some to concentration, and some to wisdom. So they're like, and what they are actually, I'm not going to go into detail about them, but if you study them, first of all, they're, we're trying, in the bodhisattva vow, one is trying to train in compassion, right, and in loving kindness, and in bodhicitta. And what these bodhisattva vows are, which again he's suggesting you should study, is they're like specific guidelines that you can check. They're actually, I think, quite useful tools that you can check yourself with to see, well, am I actually doing the work of living a more compassionate, loving life? And so, there are ones like, so for example, there are vows related to if people are asking you for things and you're not, and if people are asking you for help and you're blowing them off, are you really living the, you're not responding in some way. If people are sick or in need and you're not showing up, are you living your bodhi? So and each vow has its exceptions. It's like, well, if somebody's sick but you're helping somebody else, you can't go. That's understandable, but they're just tools for introspection around how am I actually doing it, living the kind of life I want to live. So you can study them and see if you want to take them at some point. Is what he said. Is what Lama Tsongkhapa is here saying. And he points out, he says, because if you study them and you develop a deep appreciation for them, and then you really want to take them, then you'll take them and then you'll practice them. And he's saying, whereas if you just take them without knowing what they are, it's not going to be very meaningful, which is kind of pretty clear. And then he says that to study those, he suggests one book. He makes suggestions. He says, you could study the commentary on the ethics chapter of Asanga's Bodhisattva levels, Bodhisattva Bhumi, and so on. So he mentions there are various books that teach the Bodhisattva vows. And actually, that one, the Bodhisattva levels book, is translated into English. It came out, I think, a new translation of it came out this year by Art Engel, who's a friend who comes to this area. And there are many books that teach the Bodhisattva vow. So if you're interested in that, you can read them in the Bodhisattva levels, or there are many other books that teach them, so it's not hard to find. And now Lama Tsongkhapa starts this kind of detailed section on the 6 perfections. And he starts by saying, actually I'll read this quote because it's related. He's talking about Mahayana Buddhism, and he says, although there are infinite clear divisions, when grouped together by type, all the trainings of bodhisattvas are contained in the 6 perfections. Therefore, the 6 perfections constitute the great synopsis that condenses all the essential points of the bodhisattva path. So that's a summary statement. That the 6, if you're interested in the bodhisattva path, in the Mahayana Buddhism, in that practice, that although it's an infinite, there's incredibly vast different options for training, they can all be summarized in the 6 perfections, right? And so I said them a little while ago, but so the 6 perfections are generosity, ethics, patience, joyful effort, concentration, and wisdom. And what he's saying is that you could categorize all the different trainings of bodhisattvas, all the things that one has to do to become a Buddha, in those 6 points. And then for those who are interested in sort of more scholarly study, he points out that the Buddha taught the six perfections in the sutras in a somewhat brief way, relatively. But then the texts of Maitreya and Asanga elaborate on them in great detail. And one of the commentaries pointed out that if you're interested in scholarly study, Maitreya's Mahayana Sutra Alamkara and Abhisamaya Alamkara give the most detailed presentation of the six perfections. And also Asanga's Bodhisattva Bhumi that I just mentioned gives an extremely detailed. Also other popular texts, the Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life teaches the six perfections in a very beautiful way. It's poetic. And Chandrakirti's Majjhamaka Avatara, which is called like Entering the Middle Way or Supplements the Middle Way, that also teaches the six perfections in a clear way. And then Lama Tsongkhapa starts to explain a number of points, so I'll start to go through them at least. Like, one is, he says that the six perfections are presented in that order for a number of reasons, and he's going to go through some of those reasons. But one is, they actually start, the first point in the commentary that somebody pointed out, one of the commentators pointed out, is the six perfections in that order because they are in that order for various reasons, one of which is that they go easier to harder. Remember, so generosity, why I'm putting that is it's easier to practice generosity than it is to practice ethics. And it's easier to practice ethics than it is to practice patience. And so on. So they kind of go, to some, each one is somewhat more subtle or more difficult than the one before it. It's not that you only practice one in the absence of the others, but in terms of emphasis, the earlier ones are easier in some ways than the latter ones.
So it goes generosity, ethics, patience, choice, efforts.
Choice, effort, yeah, that's the fourth. Then concentration is the fifth, and then wisdom is the sixth. So wisdom is the hardest of all the perfections then to cultivate. And that is true, isn't it? It's a lot easier to be generous than it is to be wise, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll make a shortcut. I mean, this is that point that they go from relatively easier to relatively harder. First of all, it's true for beginners like us. Like, right, as we're starting to practice, it's like, well, it is easier to be generous. It's not very hard to go give somebody something. Whereas truly being deeply ethical is harder, actually, right? And patience, if somebody's really giving you a hard time, to stay truly patient is harder than that, and so on. And then to develop deep meditative concentration is harder than just being patient. And to have wisdom is the hardest. So that there's some truth to that. And then even one point that's made, I'm just going to, Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't emphasize this, but Chandrakirti in his Majjhamaka Avatara, that text, he points out that even for advanced bodhisattvas, like very high-level bodhisattvas who have seen emptiness directly and are at very advanced levels, that even for them, as they progress towards Buddhahood, they they develop like kind of, they develop a kind of great facility with those perfections in that order. So in other words, on the first bhumi, the first level of bodhisattvas, they sort of reach a kind of, he calls it a surpassing level or a kind of sublime level of generosity. Then on the second level of bodhisattvas, they achieve that with ethics and so on. So even they kind of go through them sequentially. They've already been practicing them for a long time by that point. But in terms of like developing this kind of like remarkable, amazing ability to practice them, even that, it still happens in that order for those great bodhisattvas. Because each one's harder. So even for them, it's not, there could be bodhisattvas who are great at generosity, but their patience is not yet perfect. And eventually they'll perfect it as they continue practicing. So what applies to us also applies, it applies all the way along the path in a way that those are sequential in a way in terms of emphasis. And next, Lama Tsongkhapa talks about, now he's going to analyze the six perfections in a number of different ways. So I'll just keep going a little more. one point he makes is now he's talking about like the practice of what I was just referring to, this practice of like how if you really want to achieve Buddhahood, right, itself, that takes many lifetimes, is what he's saying. You know, it doesn't all happen in one life. And then Lama Tsongkhapa says, so if you want to do that, he uses this term high status, which in this case doesn't mean, actually he'll define it on the next page. Yeah. So here Lama Tsongkhapa is actually getting into a thing about progress over lifetimes. And so he says, if you want to be able to continue practicing the spiritual path from lifetime to lifetime, you have to have good rebirths, in a sense. High status doesn't mean like being a king or something like that, or queen. It means having a good rebirth. And then he says there are 4 qualities that sort of qualify high status. So those are having good resources, having a suitable body, being the right kind of creature, that, by good body in that sense, like not being a animal, but being a human being, for example. Having good companions, and having good activities or good actions. So those are the 4 things that make up a high status rebirth. And what he says here, actually I'll just read what he said. I'll read one line. He says, if you in order to bring the vast conduct of a bodhisattva to completion, you need many consecutive lives in order to progress along the path. Without that, there will be no progress. You won't make any progress. And then he points out, so I'll go through the number of points here. So what he's saying really is this, is to have that kind of good rebirth, from a Buddhist perspective, what the teaching says, one is that ethics, actually, is what gives one a human life. There is to be a human being. The idea, according to Buddhism, is that you have this human rebirth. It means you practice ethics in past life. That's the idea there. Generosity is the karmic cause of good resources. Patience is the cause of having good companions. Actually, joyful effort is said to be the cause of having strength, kind of a strong body and a strong mind. Concentration leads to the capacity to be able to focus, and wisdom leads to intelligence. So, what he's pointing out is, if we have to check for ourselves, but the extent we have, or as human beings right now, we have many of those qualities. And so Lama Tsongkhapa is saying that means you practice those things in the past life. And then he's saying, if you want to continue your spiritual progress in future lives, you have to continue to practice those 6 perfections, and that will create the karmic causes to have those results so that you can continue progressing on in future lives. And then he says another point, and this is again relating to past and future lives, but I'll just share it because he says it. Then he says, he emphasizes the point about wisdom, and particularly wisdom that I was getting at earlier in terms of meditation practice, that kind of wisdom where you're analyzing your own mind, right, and decreasing your own mental afflictions and increasing positive states of mind. And what he says is, if you don't cultivate that, but you cultivate the other, let's say you're generous and you're ethical and you're patient, right? He says, but if you don't cultivate wisdom, he says, then there's a great danger over the course of lifetimes. And what he's getting at is this, what he actually says is this, is that, he says, like, so if in this life, he's making this kind of point. Let's say in this life you were very generous and ethical, and you were fairly patient, but you didn't cultivate that kind of wisdom, decreasing your mental afflictions. He says, well, then what will happen? And he uses he says, basically, first point, he says, you'll have a good rebirth from that, but then you'll relate to that rebirth through mental afflictions, right? So you'll have wealth and you'll cultivate a lot of greed, or you'll have power and you'll cultivate megalomania or something, and you'll end up. And then he says, so he uses this metaphor. He says, then your spiritual progress will be like a plantain tree. In India, there's the plantain tree that they say grows very quickly, produces a lot of plantains, and then dies. And it doesn't it's not a perennial. It's not like a perennial fruit producer. It's something that produces a bunch of fruit and then drop. Not like an apple tree, right? That produces many crops and produces other apple trees and so on. And then he uses another metaphor. He says, or it's like a mule. And then he says, because mules can't produce, right? Mules can't. He says like a pregnant mule. If the mule gets pregnant, it dies because it can't. Mules can't give birth. And so, and he says, so don't make your spiritual. He says like don't make your spiritual life like that, like a plantain tree or like a mule. So what he's getting at, right, is that we need to practice those other perfections to have good rebirths, but we also need to cultivate wisdom, particularly the wisdom of decreasing our mental, that allows us to decrease our mental afflictions. Right, and so I guess what he's getting at in a certain way is this, is like, you know, if you create positive karma to have positive results externally, that as long as we are overwhelmed by our mental afflictions, we can actually, it's something Dalai Lama sometimes says, he points out, you know, being a human being is actually a great spiritual opportunity, and then having resources is also gives us opportunity. But then he points out, but also human beings can be the worst, right? Like, human beings can be the most wonderful creatures, but we could also be the most destructive creatures, right? And, you know, if we have resources like wealth, we can be generous and help others a lot, but we can also hurt others a lot. And the same thing, right? If you're strong and intelligent, you can do wonderful things with that intelligence, or you can really cause incredible suffering with our intelligence. So human beings have this, and often it's like that. Like human beings are like, they say, are like at a crossroads, you know, because we have this particular capacity. We have so much capacity, but we can use that capacity to create a lot of good or a lot of bad. And so what he's saying here is, if you practice the other perfections, you'll get these good results. But if you're not careful, you'll then, over the course of lifetimes, use those positive results to create suffering for others, and then you'll suffer, and it'll have been a waste. Anything. So instead, make sure in this life you're also decreasing your mental afflictions, so that when you get those good results in the future life by practicing the other perfections, you'll use them to continue progressing spiritually rather than to harm yourself and others.
I was going to say too, is that with that wisdom, is that you can think you're being generous, you can think that you're being ethical, and you can think that you're being patient. You can actually create more harm than good.
Yep. Actually, he gets into that in the next section. Yeah, you're right. Maybe he gets into that
Right.
coming up, particularly using the example of generosity.
Yeah, exactly. Is that you can give somebody the exact wrong thing at the exact wrong time just because that's what they want.
Yep. And so, again, the importance of wisdom. Right? And integrating wisdom with the others, right? Because it allows us to actually help ourselves and help others over time. Well, and I'll make one more point here, and then I'll pause if other people have questions. And then he says one other thing. So he says the six perfections of the so if you integrate all six perfections, you're doing the best possible thing in this life, but also for your future lives. It's the best. You're creating the best set of circumstances for your future lives. And then he says, in terms of this sort of a detail point, but he says in terms of this idea of high status, he says. He quotes the ornament, the sutra, Mahayana Sutra Alankara, the ornament of Mahayana Sutras, which I mentioned a while ago. But he makes the point, he says, as we progress in practicing the six perfections, he says, at first we develop what he calls temporary temporary high status. And that's like good rebirths or good incarnations, good lifetimes. And then he says, then there's the ultimate, or the sort of final high status, which is Buddhahood itself. And he says that's the goal. Does that make sense? So in a sense, what one is trying to do is create the causes to kind of the six perfections in a sense, and the progress of Bodhisattva. You're kind of going from higher status to higher status to higher status until you achieve the resultant high status of enlightenment itself, which is not some kind of external high status, but an inner. It's both, I guess. But it's not being a good king or a leader. It's being an internal, somebody who has a kind of the high status of a Buddha's body and a Buddha's mind. That's the place. Any other comments or questions before we go on? Because that's one little section. It was a pretty clear. Okay, then he goes through, he's continuing on about other points about the six perfections. So the next one he says is their number is definite in accomplishing the two welfares. So here's what he's talking about is that through practicing the six perfections, and sorry to get at the point you were making, but it's included in here. He makes a bunch of points. But he's talking about how through the practice of these six perfections, you achieve your own well-being and also others' well-being. Does that make sense? That's what he's, and this is an important point in Buddhism in general, is that your own well-being and others' well-being are interdependent. Right? Or so that to the extent that you're helping others, that also helps you. To the extent that you're harming others, of course, that also harms you. It's a fundamental idea in Buddhism. But here he starts by making a point. He says, when you train the bodhisattva conduct with such a support, by such a support he means that you have this special light. What he's saying here implicitly, and it came earlier in the text in terms of the precious human rebirth, is that you have this unique, you right now as a human being have this unique support for spiritual practice. This body and mind that you have are said to be the best kind of body and mind in the universe for spiritual practice. So he's saying you have that kind of support for a spiritual life, which is very rare and very unique. And then he's saying, so you can use that. The best use for that is the best imaginable use for that is bodhicitta, right? Is this wish, or is it to use that for compassion for all sentient beings, wishing to progress to enlightenment, to be of the greatest benefit to all sentient beings, is the most sublime or beautiful or wonderful use of this kind of special life you have. And then he says, and if you engage in those practices, six perfections, right, the conduct of a bodhisattva, you'll naturally achieve your own welfare and also the welfare of others. And then he says, actually I'll go through this in detail a little bit. So he says, in order to accomplish the welfare of others, it's necessary first of all to benefit them by means of material gifts. Right? One way of helping others is giving them things. Then he says, since generosity accompanied by harm to sentient beings does not lead to anything, it is itself of great profit to others to completely turn away from actions that harm others. So here he's starting to get into the complexity of what you were starting to raise, right? He's saying, it's wonderful to practice generosity, right? But then he's starting to point out, he's saying, but if your generosity isn't accompanied by ethics, it's not going to be very helpful to others, right? And actually, if you think about that, there are two different ways that that's true, or more than two actually, but we'll start with two. One is, so if you're like, if you're practicing giving to this person by harming that person, that's not really accomplishing much, right? You're harming one person to help another. It's not making the world a better place. Second point, though, is like, if you're helping somebody and then you're not ethical towards them and you harm them, that's also not, right? Like, so that's also not very meaningful, right? You won't really get anywhere. Does that make sense?
Right, it requires sophistication. So I think another example would be is that let's say that you have a family member and that they're extremely generous, right? And that they're constantly giving, but the consequence of that is that they don't have their own life in order, and so they push their own life and all their problems onto the rest of their family members. So it's just like they think they're being generous, but in reality is that in order to accomplish that state, they're hurting other people to get to that point. And that I think another good example is that, previously in all of society is that welfare and actually just like giving money or assistance like lodging or food would be done at the local level. And that at the local level they would have a lot of information and that they'd be very, in my opinion, sophisticated about the way that they would handle it because they could monitor the operation in real time. So somebody comes to them, they say, oh, I need money or help or whatever. And so they give it to them, and then they go out and they buy like meth with it. Well, that's not really helping them. But the person in that community would actually watch that process take place and be like, okay, well, no, never mind. There's strings attached if you really want this. Versus today is that we've got a federal system. And the federal system is in place worldwide too. It's in Germany and England and so on and so forth. And so this money is typically, or lodging, is distributed from a monolithic entity that has very little information. So as far as they're concerned is that it's pushed out. They don't get to see the actual effects of it when it actually hits the ground. So you've got cases like the Native American reservations where they can give out a lot of money and that money can end up with alcoholism and abuse and so on and so forth. And so it's a very unsophisticated way to accomplish the goal. So, I mean, you would think theoretically generosity is good, but generosity is like you're giving something, whether it's some sort of power that you're pushing out, and that if you're not really careful about that, and it's not done in just the right way at just the right time, then it can be incredibly destructive.
Actually, I'll elaborate on
Yeah.
a point, or make a point related to this. So one point that Lama Tsongkhapa here is making is, and actually I think it's sophisticated if you think about it, is you'll see as we go along here, he's actually getting at what has to go step by step in a way through all the 6 perfections if one is going to be really effective in practicing giving. And so, actually make a point related to what it kind of, because some of what you were saying relates to ethics, but some would relate to wisdom maybe, for example. So here, I mean, if one were to do it on a societal level, right? Like, so the first step would be, like, let's say giving, right? So giving is a good idea. Or it's like, giving's not a bad thing, right? It starts with this is the first assumption he has here. But the ethical part of it, right, would be if there's corruption, for example, right? So that would be the first step, right? Isn't there? So if we say, so if I, like, and you know, that, just recently I saw that with, when there was that I remember reading about it, particularly when there was the earthquake in Nepal and people gave money and
right, the charities.
people were taking, the government actually, it was clear findings that people had, taken
Right.
the money and not given
Right,
it to
so
the
they'll say like, okay, be generous, you're gonna do this, that person thinks that they're gonna be generous and they give like $100 to this foundation, that foundation gets it, they keep $90 and they push maybe $10 out.
And so that would be the ethics part of that.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the first, and we can see that's like very foundational, right? Isn't it? Like, in other words, as soon as you find out, well, I'm giving to help something, but there's not a foundation of ethics, in the sense of just honesty, transparency. What's the word? Like, if somebody's skimming off the top or stealing or something. Well, then the whole thing is actually, we can even feel it, right? You feel, oh, it's terrible. Like, or it feels horrible. And so like, if you we'll go through in order, I mean, through these, so the first step is generosity. The second step is there has to be an ethical foundation to it, right? And then he says, but also patience, right? Because he's making this point, and you see this actually, like, I was thinking of that when you were saying about families, right? Like, so in other words, if somebody's generous to a family member, but then they berate them and they're angry, raging at them, and right after, like, let's say right. I mean, the family's falling apart. Or it's not building the kind of life foundation that you want. It's actually a destructive influence again. So even if they're ethical, right? So you can imagine somebody who's being generous and or the same thing on a societal level, right? Or if people are practicing generosity to a group while belittling them or something, again, it's not gonna bring about the intended result over time. And so he's going through step by step that one has to have up to wisdom, right? One has to have all these other. Ultimately, one has to have all the perfections integrated. But here he makes actually, I got ahead of myself though. Here he's first making a more fundamental point, which is he's saying that for relative beginners, actually, is one way of putting this. Actually, what he says here is the first 3 perfections are mainly focused on helping others. And so what he's saying there is a couple points. One is generosity, ethics, because ethics means not hurting other people, ultimately, right? The fundamental thing of ethics is you don't hurt, you don't do things, you don't steal from people, you don't cheat them, you don't hurt, you don't kill them, you don't harm them, right? And patience means you're not getting rageful at them, right? And so one point he's making a number of points here. One is, he's saying those first 3 perfections have an emphasis on the welfare of others. Whereas the last 2 perfections, meditative concentration and wisdom, have an emphasis on benefiting yourself. Of course, those things are interdependent, right? So he's going to get into the more subtle. So actually, I got ahead of myself a little bit. First, he's actually differentiating them. He's saying, in terms of emphasis, while the first 3 perfections help you, in terms of if you're generous and ethical, it benefits you, that there's an emphasis in those on helping others. Whereas in the concentration and wisdom perfections, there's an emphasis on benefiting yourself because it makes your mind happier, but they also have a side effect of helping others, or a secondary effect of helping others. And then he's making this point about how, this is one point I would make, I guess, is in relation to what he says here, is for relative beginners, at the minimum, when one is trying to help others, one has to at least integrate the first three perfections. If one isn't capable yet of having the concentration and the wisdom, one has to begin by at least emphasizing, the generosity, but trying to integrate it with being ethical and being patient with others, right? Because you know that, right? Like in other words, if you say, I'm going to buy somebody lunch, and then you scream at them at the lunch, like, no thanks for lunch, right? Like, I didn't want your lunch, and leave me alone, or if you cheat them out of money while you're at the lunch with them, then they're not going to be glad that you bought them lunch. So at the minimum, we have to have those three. Does that make sense? Like, you really, that's like a very foundational thing. Ultimately, one has to integrate all six. Okay, so he says, makes this point. He says those first three, and he points out just the obvious, right? There was generosity. You immediately or alleviate. If you're being genuinely generous, well, you're trying at least to alleviate somebody's direct suffering of some kind of lack. Being ethical, you're trying not to directly hurt people, and patience, you're trying not to retaliate against them. So those obviously help other people. Then he says, in terms of your own welfare, that actually complete liberation from suffering comes from wisdom, conjoined with meditative concentration. Right? So those are important if you want to achieve liberation from samsara. And then he says, and then he makes a point. He says also that meditative, if you develop like deep levels of meditative concentration, it gives rise to certain effects, actually, which are, they call it like a kind of, either, they translate this word as either bliss or joy. So if you achieve a kind of deep meditative concentration, the capacity for a very deep meditative concentration, it gives rise to a kind of bliss or joy in your mind and your body. And it also gives rise to a kind of, they call it pliancy or kind of workability of your body and mind. So in other words, when, like right now, when we try to, right now, if you try to use your mind to do something, after a while you get tired, it becomes hard to do it, sometimes you can't get your mind to do what you want to do. Somebody who's achieved a kind of deep meditative concentration, whatever they want their mind to do, it just goes that direction. It's like very light and very easy to direct their mind. And also they don't have that kind of heaviness of body that we have, and kind of, like if you're, some people are different, some it's the morning, some it's night. But like, where it's like, it's hard to get yourself going, and it's hard to get your body to do what you want, and it's hard to kind of have the energy. Actually, in meditative concentration, even when you start to develop, this is why even the research shows this, right? Like scientific research shows that even with a moderate level of meditative, effective meditation, or breathing meditation, things like that, there are all these health benefits, right? And mental benefits, less depression, less anxiety, a kind of lighter mind. And that's been shown very well in scientific research. And part of what Buddhism is saying, Buddha and Hinduism actually agrees on this. They agree on this point that if you continue meditating and you achieve more and more subtle levels of concentration, those benefits continue to increase, actually. And eventually you develop this kind of capacity for kind of deep meditative concentration, which is accompanied by, actually they call it calm abiding. If you achieve calm abiding level of meditation, you have this kind of physical and mental, your body and mind are very workable and very blissful, and that makes you more able to, first of all, be happy, and secondly, use your mind for what you want. And then if you use that kind of mind to cultivate wisdom, it's very effective. And so if you can join those, that's a very effective way to, first of all, be happy yourself, and secondly, progress to liberation. And so he's saying, so you get this idea. He's saying the first three perfections emphasize the benefits of others. The last two perfections emphasize your own happiness, your own well-being. And then he says, joyous effort applies to both. That you have to apply a kind of joyous effort to both. So the joyous effort helps you achieve your own welfare and helps you achieve others' welfare. And I'll make a side point here. This point, joyous effort, right? The idea there is that joyous effort means that you have energy and a kind of enjoyment, or joy, in doing these kinds of positive things. Does that make sense? So like, joyous effort means that practice of joyous effort doesn't mean like, it's not like, oh, I should do this. Oh, I have to. Like, it's like,
I
that
wanna do
doing,
this.
what's that?
I want to do this.
Yeah, I want to do this, and doing it is exciting, is fun, is joyful, is happy. It's like, wow, I get to do that. It's almost like that. Oh, I get to do, like I get the opportunity to help somebody, or I get the opportunity to practice meditation, or I get the opportunity to, like, where you feel happy to do that. Yeah, so you get it like that, and that's that practice. So it's cultivating that kind of state where you're have an enthusiasm, maybe, I don't know what word to use, like an enthusiasm or joy in doing these positive practices. And so then he makes the point. So he says, therefore, to bring about the two welfares, your own welfare and the welfare of others, the perfections are definitely six. So he's saying you need all six to be integrated to bring about your own and others' welfare. And then he quotes a verse that mentions all six. What is that? Oh, okay. And then he says, he makes this point where he's saying, first of all, that to accomplish the welfare of others, you really do need all six, right? You need, so it was what I was saying earlier. You need to integrate in concentration and wisdom with the others, with the first four perfections. And then he makes this other point. He said, I'll read what he says here. He quotes that verse, a verse that has this line, abiding and freedom. And then he says, abiding refers to this calm abiding, right? So the mind that can calmly abide on whatever object the meditator wants it to abide on, in a state of meditative concentration. And he says, abiding and freedom, that freedom refers to freedom from samsara, or cyclic existence, which is the result of wisdom. And so what he's getting at there is that one has to integrate, ultimately, this kind of mind of calm abiding, or deep meditative concentration, with wisdom, and that's the way to achieve freedom from samsara. Yeah, so that was that point. And then he makes another point, which again, we've kind of already said this, but I'll just say it briefly. He again goes through what the six perfections are, and he points out that, actually I'll just say, so he points out that through generosity you alleviate others' poverty. Through ethics, you stop harming others. Through patience, when you're harmed, you don't retaliate and harm them. Through joyous effort, this is an important point. Through joyous effort, also, if you don't have joyous effort, you'll get discouraged. Does that make sense? So part of joyous effort is, he makes an important psychological point here, is part of this idea of joyous effort is that there's a recognition that spiritual practice is not always easy, right? And part of spiritual practice is that, actually, whether you're practicing spirituality or not, you're going to come across hardships, right? Like, whatever you do in life, you're going to come across difficult people and difficult circumstances. And part of what he's saying here is if we don't learn to cultivate joyous effort and enthusiasm, then we'll, actually, whether we're working on a worldly goal or a spiritual goal, we'll give up when we come across hard times. And what he's saying is a kind of joyous effort is a mind that's like undaunted, right, also by obstacles. And so that then you'll overcome those difficulties. And then he actually points out, this is a side point. He says, if you develop those kind of deep meditative concentration states, that also enhances your ability to help others. And he's saying how? He's saying according to Buddhism, when people develop very deep meditative concentration states, they also, what's the word? Actually, I'll share a side point about this. I thought it was fascinating. What part of this is like, I noticed this in general in life, like, it's taught in Buddhism. So to a deeper degree or something. But it's this. I'll make a small point here. Have you ever noticed, like, I've noticed this with people, like if you're not willing to face or if you can't look at something in yourself, then you can't really understand it in somebody else, right? Like if you're not willing to look at let's say, I've noticed that, I'll give an simple example. I've noticed like when people are grieving, right? Somebody who's like afraid of the emotions of grief just avoids the person, right? And can't empathize. They can't be there with that person.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. So I kind of notice the same thing when it comes to personal responsibility, is that I've noticed that some people can't take any personal responsibility whatsoever. And that I thought about it, and I was thinking like, well, why do they do this? Why can't they just accept that, they're at fault in this situation? And the conclusion I came to is that with some people is that if they were to look in and take personal responsibility for something, they would feel so bad that emotionally they can't take that idea. It's just too painful, they don't even want to touch it. So it's much easier for them to rationalize their activities and create any circumstance possible that doesn't leave them at fault, because they're not going to feel that way. And I think that a lot of people, they don't want to look inside because sometimes it's going to be unpleasant. And what's their tolerance for pain in that case? And there was something else that I noticed, that as you were talking, I kind of realized what you were saying. So when it comes to the wisdom, I was thinking like wisdom as being internal and external. And the way I saw it, immediately was kind of like that external wisdom, where you need wisdom in order to engage in the process of generosity and ethics and patience in order to be effective in that process. But then I was thinking too is that, then the idea occurred to me, is that what if you have somebody that has the right motivation and then they totally mess up the execution and they make everything worse, okay, versus a person that is exceptionally good at execution, but their motivation is awful. So they create a lot of good in the world, but they did it for exactly the wrong reason. And so I was thinking, well, the person that created a lot of good in the world but did it for the wrong reason, then that's an internal wisdom, and they're going to carry those wrong reasons with them. So they'll get some benefit from doing good, but in the grand scheme of things, is that they didn't get rid of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking is that when you look at the concentration of wisdom, is that they're kind of like, they underline the first three, and that they can be, they can either be applicable to that or applicable to yourself in that case.
And part of that, I guess, so part of that then is, actually one has to start really with the wisdom in relation to oneself. Understanding oneself, understanding one's own nature, understanding one's own mind. And then one can understand the mind of others, right? Then one can understand how to help others.
Right.
And it goes in that order.
Yeah, the Illuminati actually had a quote. It was in Latin. It's like "Nocte te ipsum, nocte te," I forget the other one, but it's "Know yourself, know others," essentially.
Yeah, and it has to go in that order to some extent.
Yeah.
And I guess, and that's part of the implication with meditative concentration, is that through meditative concentration you get to know your own mind in a very deep way. And the deeper you know your own mind, the deeper you'll know others' minds. And so they say that, like, they sometimes even use words like clairvoyance or something like that to describe the states that these very advanced meditators have. And that's part of the idea, though. Actually, I remember that, like they often say that in Buddhist texts, that a person who's achieved calm abiding can achieve these deep meditative concentrations, can have clairvoyance. And then Khensa Rinpoche, when he was describing that, he said, well, if the person, it's not just meditative concentration, it's that then the person uses that meditative concentration to look deeply at their own emotions, and at their own mind, at their own thoughts. And that to the extent that they've done that, they become able to see the thoughts and minds of others. Which I was like, oh, that's interesting. And the point being, then you can help others more. Right? Because if you have that ability to sort of know your own mind and know the minds of others in a deeper way, then you're more able to help other people. And the same goes for wisdom, right? In other words, if you've realized through wisdom the ultimate nature of your own way of existing, then you can explain that to others in a very deep way. If you haven't, then it's just intellectual or something. If you don't have the intellectual, you can't even explain that. If you have the intellectual, you can explain it intellectually, but not experientially. And so wisdom helps you help. So what he's getting at here is all of them help you help others, right? And that's kind of what you were getting at earlier. Here he's applying it in a very deeply personal way, in a sense. Like, there's that meditative concentration and that wisdom of wisdom understanding your own nature. So it's a very personal insight or something. But if one has that, then one is able to sort of engage with others in a way that somebody who doesn't have that can't do. Actually, it's not possible.
I actually noticed something similar to that. So I was thinking, is that when you read the old Buddhist texts, and that they mentioned that the Buddha would talk to somebody, and that they would know their mind, so he would know their mind so well that essentially he could predict what they were going to do next. And the way I kind of saw it at the time is that, when it comes to wisdom, it's the wisdom of emptiness and the wisdom that we create a lot of the reality around us. And so that reality has some element of truth, but largely it's conceptual and it may not be real. It is theoretical. And that once you kind of like think about it, well, okay, well, who I am is kind of theoretical. It's not really as absolute as I once considered. So once you kind of like add doubt into your own existence to a little bit, then when you're talking to another person, your mirror neurons can light up to a certain degree because you don't have that rigid structure in place of what you are, that you can actually become like the person you can talk to. Just your brain actually kind of rewires and becomes. And then once you do that, it's easy to follow the steps because your brain is now operating like the way of that person. But if you didn't have the wisdom to know that your personality isn't as real as you think it is, then you're going to have a lot more resistance to actually getting into somebody else's head. That's just the way I saw it, just a little.
Yeah, one point I would make is I think what you're saying is even true on that's even something that, like for example, the empathy, the kind of empathy you're describing with your mirror neurons is something we all going to do. To the extent that we decrease our self-preoccupation and rigidity in relation to our own self-image, we can do that to varying degrees. And then I guess according to Buddhism, I guess, first of all, the Buddha, but even a person with calm abiding, for example, has capacities for doing that are beyond what we can yet imagine to some extent because we
Right.
haven't yet had those experiences.
And some people are just exceptionally good at it. I think that women are naturally exceptionally good at that. I remember a girlfriend saying to me, "What did you mean by that?" And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean what I mean by that?" It's exactly what I said. But she's already kind of going into the point of like, what was the context within your own head when you came up with those words? Because those words may have a meaning other than what she said. So it's kind of like digging deeper into that. I just noticed when you talk to people in society, is that what I've noticed is that the technical skills are going up day by day. Is that we're becoming exceptionally good with technical skills, but the soft skills are going down day by day. And that I think there's a variety of reasons for that, but I think that one of the reasons, if I'm going to be nice about it, is that people think that soft skill development is automatic rather than something that you have to work to develop. And it's something that you have to work to develop, and it's something that you have to emphasize and put time and effort into. Another thing is that when it comes to soft skills, people think they don't need them because they're so technically good. And then I think a good example of that kind of like that sort of like idea in Western society is the TV show House. Okay, which if you ever watch it, it's about a doctor who's exceptionally brilliant and good at what he does, but his personality is absolutely awful. But he's so good at what he does is that they're forced to use him. So it's kind of like the give and take between the two. And it's just like, well, you want to know what is that you have to be so good in order for people to deal with your lack of soft skills. It's going to be rare, and you really shouldn't bank on that one. So the ideal state is to develop both. And that if you don't have the soft skills and the ability to empathize and fire off those mirror neurons and understand other people, it's kind of going to be like you have a very powerful engine, but you don't have any traction to the road. So you can just spin in place, because we all have to deal with people, and we all have to interact within an organization and structure.
Well, and you're probably familiar with that. In relation to what you're saying, you're probably familiar, if not, wonderful work by Dan Goleman.
Oh, yeah.
His work's great on emotional intelligence, which is kind of what you're getting at.
Right, and so I kind of wonder, like, with this rigidity, is that what you see in Western civilization is that they emphasize everything but wisdom and that internal introspection. And that, what's funny is that, you can go to classes, you can be very good at cybersecurity, you can be very good architect, and those are all technical intelligence-based skills, but there's no wisdom development. And I think that typically is that when you saw that wisdom development, it's something that you got from churches in the social structure in the West for a long time, but you also got it from extended family members. And so you got it, from your parents, you got it from your grandparents, your aunts and uncles. They would have life experiences, and that they convey that wisdom to you. But otherwise, it's that, today is that when it comes to wisdom, it's kind of like, well, you have to develop it yourself. And if you're not thinking that you even have to develop it, then you won't.
I'll just share one. Okay, stop in a minute, but I'll share one more. One reflection. One thing is, in terms of wisdom, for me personally, I've noticed over the years that I found such a. I'm sure some of you who study with Tibetan teachers have noticed that, but it's such a relief, in the sense that to share this as a side point. Like, oftentimes it strikes me that Tibetan culture, I mean, Tibetan culture has its faults like any culture, but one thing that's really wonderful, actually, just amazing about Tibetan culture, is the emphasis on wisdom as a culture. And I mean, having spent time with some of the monasteries and things like that, like, how do I say, like, actually, I was visiting, actually, because I was in California because of the forest fires. I was with friends, and they were watching some sporting events, and I was like, like, you know, it was like a sense of, like, we were just reflecting together on how, like, there's this incredible emphasis on sports heroes, right? Like, and they make $25 to $40 million a year or something like that, and I was like, all they can do is, like, you know, they can just play a game, like,
Right.
and I was like recognizing how in Tibetan, one thing I love about Tibetan culture personally is that it's a culture where the people who have that status in that culture have that because of wisdom. And that's the emphasis in the culture is like, oh, this person's so wise, like, and they're whoever's like
That would be
the
nice.
most wise is the person who's most respected,
Uh-huh.
actually. Whereas here it tends to be, you know, whoever's either most good at the sport or most rich or most famous.
Right, that emphasis on technical abilities, and what you see is that you see like exceptionally rich people in this country, and that they're just mind-blowingly good at what their job is. Otherwise, they wouldn't be that rich. But then they use it to buy light gold Ferraris, and they buy the most obnoxious-looking things possible. And it's just like you've achieved power, but you have zero wisdom as to what to use that power for.
Well, that's part of why it's for me, it's been such a relief to spend time with some of the Tibetan teachers where, like, their whole life has been dedicated to cultivating wisdom because that's what was, from the time they were little kids, that's what was valued and what was emphasized and what was the thing to cultivate, you know, and so they have, that's a gift, I think.
Well, right, and if you cultivate wisdom first, so my actual introduction to Buddhism was before I even knew anything about Buddhism whatsoever, is I had this epiphany when I was like 18 or 19 years old, and it just occurred to me is that everything that had happened in my life, you know, I thought it was totally real, and that's exactly what happened to me. But then I thought it just like, it was like a thunderbolt, where it's just like, that's just what I think happened to me. Is that a lot of it was colored by whatever emotions I was feeling at the time. It could be real, it could not be real. It was like that fundamental doubt. And that it's like, I wouldn't go so far as to, when people take it too far, it becomes nihilism, which is nothing's real and it's all theoretical and stuff like that. There's some element of truth in the way that you perceive events, but it may not be as tangible and as fundamental as you think it is.
You're coming too.
I
can
could
tell.
speak on this for hours. You know, experience. There's no like experience to,
Right.
you know, bring wisdom. And yes, I agree with both of you. I mean, like, you take a look, teacher salaries, you know, compared to athletes or, you know, tech guys. But as well, I mean, that's the part of the culture that we're at. And you got to take the good with the bad, and just move on and make our society a lot better. Not like ponder or like be like, oh, this is bad, this is not what I like. But I also see like, and this is more on the millennials, like younger generation, is they're so attached to their senses. It's absurd and kind of like a little sickening to me. And it's just like, I try to keep an open mind, but that comes to, they're so sensitive and like, you know, so non-empathetic, and as well like you know, they want to be like oh, I expect this, you know, expectations, and that leads to suffering, you know. That's the root of suffering. So it goes back to all these different things where it's just like, you know, now that I'm older and I've gone through so much stuff, me personally, like spiritually, I feel like I've grown so much, and you know, I went through a 2-year span of, you know, when it rains it pours, and it got really, really bad, and I got through it, and I I thought I had gained a lot of wisdom, and I still do think I gained a lot of wisdom. But at the same time, not like looking back at Buddhism and all this other stuff, it's like there's so much more for me to learn. You know, it's just kind of like the tip of the iceberg type of thing.
Which is a great insight to have, isn't it?
Yeah, I totally agree. Is that what I found is that usually people that develop wisdom have experienced something bad to a certain degree, and so it was one of those things where it's just like, yeah, and it's like one of those things where it's just like, man, that did not work out so well. You know why? And so I totally agree with it too. Is that our society is that we're very technically good at what we do. We don't have wisdom. If we took the exact opposite side, if we had Tibet, where they focus on wisdom all the time and no technical abilities, then we wouldn't have some of the things that we have available to us, like our infrastructure and our medical system and so on and so forth. So that's all very valuable, and that it's kind of the middle way. You have to choose a middle between the two, and that I wonder is that there's in many cases is that going back to sort of like pain leading to wisdom to a certain degree, is that a lot of people in this country, particularly the people that are well off and we've done a good job, is that some of them haven't really had any pain in their life. Is that maybe their parents had pain or their grandparents did, and they set up a system where they wouldn't have to experience that. So what happens is that they can be very good and they've got a nice and easy life, but they never had that incentive to develop wisdom. And I'm not saying that's in all cases, because some people do it anyway, but I just wonder if it's just like sometimes maybe things, if they're too easy, then you don't see a culture where they're going to value wisdom as much as they should.
I was going to stop it. It made me think of actually it's not really a quote, a paraphrase of a point by Sakya Pandita, who was a great master in Tibetan. But his point was, he said, if you want to be comfortable, forget about being wise. And if you want to be wise, forget about being comfortable. And it wasn't exactly how he said it. That's the way I memorized it, because it was sort of rephrased that way. But I thought there's a truth to that, isn't there, really, that you're getting in your experience. Okay, well, let's do we always do a couple of verses of dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, that is not arisen, may it arise and grow. Or has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara